Okay. Yeah, Amir. I think there was some issue, and we finally figured that out. Yeah. Uh,
No, it's good.
yeah,
Good that we
we'll
had an
get
issue.
started. Yes, yes.
Yeah, because a lot of
Maybe we can start with the introduction itself, in the sense, just a brief introduction, and immediately on the workshop.
yeah, sure, Kiran. So hey everyone, for those who joined in last few minutes. So I'm Amir. I work as a senior front-end engineer at HackerRank. Our team mostly works on the IDs that you see in HackerRank. Recently, I've been very excited about Remix because Remix is kind of a framework for React, which has the right abstraction. It sits in the right sweet spot, which provides you a lot of flexibility. At the same time, if you follow Remix philosophy, you end up building a performant app which is accessible, which is performant, and which doesn't depend on JavaScript, which is a good thing, right? Like most of the things that we write today, if the user goes and disables JavaScript, the entire web app is not going to run. But Remix is gonna ensure that even without JavaScript, our site runs. Right, with JavaScript, it's gonna be a little bit better experience, but without JavaScript, it's gonna still work. So yeah. So it's going to be a hands-on workshop. So we'll be doing code together. So if you have any questions or anything at any point in time, feel free to unmute yourself or ping in the chat. We'll try to get your questions answered. Or if you're stuck at any point in time, feel free to again unmute yourself. Right. So before we step into Remix itself, I just wanted to cover some groundworks on like some jargons like server-side rendering and client-side rendering. Some of you might be already aware of it, but let's be sure that we all are on the same page. So there are two strategies when it comes to writing a web app. They are called server-side rendered apps and client-side rendered apps. Client-side rendered apps are nothing but SP or single-page applications that we call. Right. So in a single page application, the entire app is rendered using JavaScript. Right. There is no server involved. It's just static assets that are served by the server. And when the JavaScript starts to run, it renders the entire page. Right. I have a good example of that because when I started building my portfolio, I did it on React. It's a server-side rendered app. If I go and view the page source of this, you would see that it just has the content to load JavaScript. There's no specific content that you actually see in the page, right? There is just title. Other than that, there's just script tag and link tags, right? So one disadvantage with this is if I say disable JavaScript to my browser and reload, it's not going to work. And it's going to say that I need to enable JavaScript to make this app work, right? So one disadvantage is you need to wait for the entire JavaScript to be downloaded and to be passed and run by the browser for you to see any meaningful result in the browser, right? Which is going to degrade your user's performance. Let's just say the user is coming on a less powerful mobile device or some iPad, which is not that powerful. Then it's going to take longer time for the user to even see anything on the screen, right? And they have to download some heavy JavaScript bundle for them to see some something on the screen. Until then, it's going to be just a blank screen, right? But client-side renders app do have their own advantages. Since it's the entire page is managed by JavaScript, you can do some crazy stuff. Routing, you can manage the routing using JavaScript. There is no request made to the server itself. So it would be little of a good app-like experience in the browser, but you do trade off the performance in terms for getting that smooth experience, right? And you also trade off some level of search engine optimizations, because when Google makes a request to your page, it's going to just get an empty index.html file. To index that file, it has to run the JavaScript file, right? If there's any data loading that is happening that needs to bring some data and show some data, then Google is not going to do that, right? Google is going to have some incomplete or partial web page, which is not not great. You might get some incorrect SEO results, right? So on the other hand, we have something called server-side rendering. So server-side rendering tries to kind of fill the gaps that we have in client-side rendering. So what they do in server-side rendering is they take your single page application, your React application, they render it in the server and then send it to the client. So in that case, what would happen? The client would first get the entire HTML, not just the index of HTML. It would have highlighted content of everything that you wanted in the page, right? And then JavaScript would kick in, and then it would become a single page application. So server-side rendered app provides you kind of a client-side rendering app, but when the user makes the first request, he or she can get an entire page rather than waiting for JavaScript to run to see any website on the browser. Right? Server-side rendering almost removes every trade-off that we had. Like SEO is going to be better because Google is going to get the entire HTML, not just the script tags, and the performance is going to increase because like the user can see something right away in the screen rather than waiting for the JavaScript to run. So most of the React frameworks that we have today, like Next.js, Remix, they are server-side render frameworks. So they just render your app in the server and provide you some provide you all the benefits of SSR with less effort from you. SSR itself is very complicated. If you try to do it from scratch, you have to handle a lot of nasty edge cases. That's why most of us move towards frameworks like Next.js and Remix. Right? So if you're aware of Next.js, Remix is not that different, but it has its own set of philosophies. So every framework has its own philosophy, and Remix has its own philosophy. And that's why I was saying that philosophy is a good sweet spot with right amount of abstraction and right amount of flexibility. You can do a lot. So any questions till now? Does anyone has any doubts or?
Amir, some people are mentioning that your voice is not clear. Maybe microphone issue.
Just a minute. Let me connect my headphone back.
Yeah. Meanwhile, others, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat, either in the YouTube or chat, Zoom. If you are on Zoom, you can also unmute yourself and ask questions.
So is my voice clear now, Yashwadi?
Okay, we will carry on. If something happens, we will adjust it after a little while.
Okay, makes sense. Good.
Rupesh, so you can ask your question. I know what is the, if you can explain a little bit more, what is the confusion? Yeah, maybe we'll continue, Amir.
Sure, cool. So before we get started, let me show you what.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I could actually I'm not getting the what is mean the server side rendering and client side rendering. Could you give me a short short description again?
Sure. So let's just say let's talk about client side rendering, right? So have you ever used Create React app, or have you built any React app using Create React app or any other tooling for it?
Yeah, no sir. I built websites on purely JavaScript.
Okay, got it. You built on JavaScript, right?
Yes.
So what we mean by client-side rendering is you use JavaScript to render HTML on the page. Okay. So let's just say you wrote a script tag with JavaScript, which is going to manipulate the DOM to add a H1 tag, right?
Okay.
Let's just say you go and disable the JavaScript. Your page wouldn't work, right? Because without JavaScript, the H1 tag wouldn't come up, correct?
Yes.
So if you take React is kind of doing the same. If you run React today, it would take whatever the HTML tag that you provided to React, it converts them into a way by which it manipulates the DOM. It would access the DOM, put all the tags that you had in the DOM, right? So
Yes, sir.
in that case, if you go and disable JavaScript, React wouldn't run. So what would happen? All the DOM elements that you specified for React to put it in the DOM would not work, right?
Yes, sir.
So to avoid this situation, right, what people do today is they take your page with the JavaScript and run it in the server, right? So in the server,
Yes, sir.
they have a browser-like environment, right? They emulate the browser in the server. So in the server, the JavaScript is always enabled, right? So they run the HTML with your JavaScript, and they get back the HTML from the browser. I mean the emulated browser in the server, and send it to your browser, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, even without running JavaScript, your browser now has the content that the server sent, right?
Yes, yes, sir.
So SSR is nothing but moving your rendering of pages using JavaScript over to the server. So the server is going to render the page with JavaScript for you once and send the content, so that your browser doesn't have to run this JavaScript to see some content, right? So by this way, what would happen? Even before running JavaScript, you would have some content that the server sent. Make sense?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So this would be more performant, because if you didn't do that, then the browser user would see a blank screen. Then the JavaScript bundle would download, which would take 3 or 4 seconds. Till then, it would be a blank screen. And when the JavaScript loads, it would render it, and the user would see the updates, right? So that's
Yes.
the difference.
Yeah, so I'm getting confused here. So you said that JavaScript will be running on the server side, right? But
Yep.
so when we do the client side validations, I mean, like in any input field validations, how will it work there then in the SSR case?
Right. So the user is going to type all those inputs in the browser, right? So those inputs, those validations, right, won't happen in the server, right? There is no need for it. Like, let's just say you're requesting a form page, right? The server is going to render it and give you back the form. It's not going to type anything in the server itself, right? So once it reaches your browser, anything that happens, it's going to stay in your browser. Okay, so the validations are going to happen in the browser. Only the form element is going to be sent back from the server.
Okay, so I mean, along with the HTML code, it will ship the JavaScript code as well for the validation, client side validation.
Exactly. So like when the server sends back your HTML, it also sends back the JavaScript. So right, then what would happen? Like you would see something in the screen, and then JavaScript would kick in, and it would add all the JavaScript related stuff in your browser.
Yeah, got it. Thanks.
Cool. So let's now move on to Remix. So before we even start, let me show you what we'll try to build. Based on the time, we may not be able to build everything, but let's see. So the idea of this workshop is not about CSS or anything, not about basic JavaScript also. So the UI is going to be very basic, no fancy CSS at all, right? So we have a product listing page. We have a product details page that we will build. There is an issue, but we'll fix it. And then you can delete it, right? So that's what we're going to build today, right? And if you view page source here, you'd see that this would have the data that is shown in the page. It's not just going to have the JavaScript, right? So that's the power of Remix, right? So to get started, what would I suggest is please go ahead and clone this repo. I'm gonna ping it in the chat. So clone this repo. So after I have cloned it, run an npm install. That should do. So I'm going to give you a few minutes for you to clone. Let ping in the chat once you have cloned and run npm install. Cool. So meanwhile, the npm install is running. Let me take you through the folder structure of a Remix app, right? So the Remix app, once you scaffold Remix app, you would have a folder called app. Inside that, there are two important files. One is called entity.server.jsx. Another thing is called entity.client.jsx. So entity.server.jsx is your actual server. So everything inside this is going to run inside a server. And this is where Remix is going to render your front end in the server. So this is the part where I was saying it's going to emulate a browser in the backend, render your app using JavaScript, and send back the content. Right? So then we have an entity.client.jsx. So this is going to totally happen in your browser. So this is where we call a method called hydrate. So if some of you are aware of hydration, in React, hydration is nothing but once you get back, the content that was rendered by the server in the backend, right? You want to tell React that now go and add all the event listener and all other stuff once JavaScript. So that's what we call it as hydration in React. Or for the case, you can take any framework. When it comes to SSR, there is always two steps. One is when you request the server, you get back the HTML. Once you got the HTML, then when JavaScript loads, you tell JavaScript that, okay, now you go and add all the event listener, hydrate the entire DOM, so that when user clicks on any button, the JavaScript is able to handle those stuff, right? So that's the hydration process. And then we have the routes. Routes is nothing but, as the name implies, routes in your server. So using this, you can, create more pages, more routes and stuff. And root.js is nothing but something that bootstraps your entire app. But index.js is the first route that you see, the root route. But root.js is nothing but it's gonna bootstrap your app in the client.
Amir, can you slightly increase the font size?
Sure. Does it look okay now?
Yeah, I guess so.
Cool. So I think npm install have run. Let me know if you are still running npm install and setting it up. So once you have set it up, we need to run two commands. One is start the Remix server. So we need to use the command npm run dev. This would start the Remix server. So to set up a backend, I have created a very minimalistic backend in the API folder. You can totally ignore this because this is not our area of focus today. To start the server, you can just say npm run start server. This would start an Express server for us to work with. So it gives us the backend APIs that we would want. So once the Remix app starts, you should be able to go to localhost 3000, and you would see this page, which is nothing but the index.jsx that we had in the routes folder. Right? If I make any changes here, you would see that it is getting reflected over there. Right? So I'm going to remove this entire HTML because we want to customize it, right? Or I would leave this in place. But let's just say you want to create a new page, right? This is the root page that you want. Now let's just say you want to create a new page, right? So in Remix, it's pretty simple. What you can do is inside the route folder, let's just say you want to create a new route, right? The route is going to be /products, right? I want to create a new products route. Right now it's 404. You can just create a products folder and create an index.jsx in it. And you can export a React component. Right, and now if you reload, I need to save it first. So default function. Let me try restarting the Remix server. Okay, sorry, my bad. Did the syntax. Cool. So yeah, we have a products page now. So this is what we call as routing. So routing is nothing but ability for you to create new pages in Remix. In Remix, the pages are laid out in terms of folders and files. So if you want to create a route, you go and replicate the same in your folder structure, and you would get that in your route in the browser, right? There are multiple ways to do this. I created a products folder and then created index.js. You can do it another way also, like let's just say you can delete this products folder and you can directly create a file called products.jsx. Right? That would also do the same thing, right? So it follows the same structure that we use for all JavaScript files. It's gonna honor your index.js file also. So that should be fine. So you can create a folder and call index.js and it's gonna pick that up. Cool.
Amir, I have a question. Can I ask?
Sure, go ahead.
So like we have created the products, so it's show the all the products. So like if you go to the product detail page, so it will so does it create the dynamic routes also like the other? Okay.
Good question. Actually, a good question. So to make sure that everyone's on the same page, what was supposed I'm sorry, I didn't get your name.
Mukesh.
Yeah, what Mukesh was trying to say is, let's just say we have a product details page like product/1, and the third part of this route is very dynamic. It can be a UID, it can be an ID, right? It's very dynamic. How are we going to handle that, right? So Remix has a way to do that. So use something called a colon in front of it, and you say id.jsx, right? Every framework have their own way of providing this kind of routing. This is Remix way. If you have used React router, this should look familiar to you, because in React router we would specify colon ID or colon UUID to specify dynamic part of a route. Same applies here, right? So I can say export default function. Right now, if I reload, you get product details. No matter what is the value you give, it's gonna always get the product details. Does that answer your question, Mukesh?
Yeah. Got it.
Cool. So now we have product details page. We have product page, products page. So now let's move on to feel free to create these files in your file. If you want time, feel free to ping in the chat. But I think these are straightforward. You can create files, add some two components, add component to it, and it should be done deal.
Amir, is there any way to validate those params? Like, let's say I want the ID to be only an integer, not string. How can we do that?
So right now, I don't right now from a perspective of the data type, we cannot validate. We can validate when it hits our code. We can get the string or ID and feel if it's an invalid ID or something, we can throw 404 page.
Okay.
But from the route definition itself, we cannot say this is the data type that should be looking for, because end of the day they are all string for Remix.
Got it.
Cool. So let's move on to the next part, where I want to fetch the list of products right from the backend. I don't want to hard code something, so I want to fetch it from the backend. So if you remember, we started a server, Express server, right? So if you go to localhost 8000, it's running in the 8000 port, and you hit the products route, you would get two products right now. One is Apsara, another thing is Bose headphones, right? So it's a JSON with array of products, right? So I'm going to do the same. So in a classic React way, right? What we would do, we would create a state for this, right? I would say products, get products, state for this. I would say by default it's gonna be an empty array, right? take another list item, right? So I'm gonna iterate to it. So inside the list, I'm gonna say product dot, right? We did have the product dot title, right? In the so then by default we are going to have an empty product, so we need to fetch the products, right? So I'm going to do a use effect here so that it runs whenever the component loads, right? As usual, I'm going to do fetch request. Right, and I'm going to do again, sorry, response from it. I want to get the JSON of the response, and I'm going to get the products, which I'm going to set it in the products. Cool. So let me try it again. 8,002. Did I miss anything here? Okay.
I think there is some issue with map function. Has it dot map that
Yeah, you're missing a parenthesis.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. Cool. Cool. Now it should be fine. Thanks for that. Cool. Yeah. So we can see that the products are loading from the backend, but it still has one issue, right? One thing you can clearly see that this particular two product load after a second, like few milliseconds, right? Which is not a great experience. Let's say the user, like you can see that clearly from the network stack. If I reload the page, you can see it's making a request to the backend for products, right? The JavaScript is making a request, and if the request takes time, user would see just products, but not a list of products, right? Now, if I go ahead and disable JavaScript now and reload, you don't even get the products, because right now the part that is making request to your backend is your JavaScript. If JavaScript doesn't load, you don't get the list of products. Does this problem statement make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
Cool. So this problem is what we call it as data loading. So it's a very common problem in SSR. You cannot load product you shouldn't load your data in your client side. If you try to fetch your data from the client side, if the JavaScript goes away, then it's not going to load the data. Or let's just say your network is slow, the client is going to make the request and take it from the backend, right? So what if we can do this data fetching in the backend, right? There are multiple advantages to it. If we can do this data fetching in the backend, first thing, your backend is going to be very closer to your front-end server, because they are on the same machine, maybe on the same machine, they might be on the same cloud. So the response is going to be very fast. It's going to be very reliable, right? And if you do the data fetching in the server, what would happen? You would see the data already there when the user hits the page. There is no separate data request made from the front end. You will see the products already rendered rather than they are popping off after a second, right? Make sense? So every framework, every SSR framework has its own way of communicating how to load data in the backend, right? There is a separate specific way each framework wants you to tell them this data you need to fetch from the backend. I'm not going to fetch it from the front end, right? So Remix way of saying it is you need to export a function called loader, okay, from your PI component. This function is going to run in your backend. It's going to run in your server component. It's not going to run in your front end. So what would happen? This would help you to fetch the data in the server itself rather than you trying to fetch it in the client, right? So this is where I'm going to do the fetching right now, right? So I'm going to do the same fetch thing that we did, right? But right, since it's an async function, we should convert this into an await format so that we can tell this function that it's not complete until we fetch the data. Right? I'm going to return the product now. So I'm going to remove this data fetching thing altogether now. But now, how do our front-end component is going to know what was the data fetched by the backend, right? So for that, Remix has a useful hook for you called user loaded data. So it's going to somehow magically tie your data that was fetched from the backend to your front end. There's no need for you to think about it, but usually, just to unwind the abstraction, it sets the data from that it fetched in the backend on the window object, and from the window object, the front end pulls it. But there's no need for you to think about it. We just use user loaded data, which means you're going to get the data that was fetched in the backend using the load function. Cool, make sense? Any doubts to know? Cool. So then, if I come over here and reload now, you can see that there is no request right now made in the front end to fetch the product. Right? There is a request that is made only to fetch the page, but no XHR request is being made to fetch the product itself. Right? And the products pop in place without without any lag, right? And you can see in the rendered page that you do see the products that got rendered in the page, right? And if I go ahead and now disable JavaScript, I did disable the source. Why am I not able to get this? Okay, I think I already disabled it. I need to enable that. So JavaScript is already enabled, but if I go and disable JavaScript, your page is still going to work because it's totally rendered from the server. You don't need anything in particular, right? Any questions, do you know?
Amir, there was a question on, can you explain a little bit more about the loader and use loader data?
Sure. So loader function is nothing but a way by which you are telling Remix that this particular function you need to call in the server, and the server is going to load the data that you need in the front end, right? So previously the problem that we had was the client was fetching the data, right? Or you can think in this way, it was loading the data. The front end was loading the data, right? But you want the backend to load the data or the server to load the data. So you tell the server to do that by using this loader function, right? You are exporting this loader function, right? So the backend can import this and call the loader function. And once it gets the data out from the loader function, it would provide it to the front end using the loader data hook. So this hook is going to tie up your backend with the front end. So this hook is going to get whatever data that was fetched from the backend to your front end when it gets rendered in the server. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So one more question I have is all the pages server rendered, in the sense, for example, let's say I came to this route from another client side page, but then how the request will happen on the client side?
Exactly, that's a good question. So there are two ways by which you may navigate, right? So let's just say the first way you navigated was through a client-side routing. You clicked on a link, you came onto through a client routing. It's not hitting the server in that time, right? So in that case, Remix is intelligent enough to call the loader function in your client side.
Okay. Then how will it handle the loading states and everything? Is it using suspense or something?
It's not using suspense, but what would do, you'd see a little blank screen until the data fetches. But you can do suspense and stuff.
Okay. So as of now, there is the products. It seems like a synchronous thing like products. So there is no state called is loading.
Right now it's no it's loading, but that's why you will see a blank screen when you navigate through client-side routing.
Okay.
But you can add suspense and stuff in your case if you want. But it's kind of looks like a synchronous request at that point.
Okay. Got it.
So there was another question: if the API takes a long time to respond, what would happen? Okay, so that's a great question. So let's just say the API takes this function is going to be called in the server, right? So let's just say the server took a long time to respond, or the server had an error. What would happen? So in that case, let's just say it's taking too long time, right? Then you would see a loading icon, you would see like the page is still loading, right? So that's not a great experience, but that would happen only when you are having a backend API which is very slow, which shouldn't be the case. Mostly you should try to optimize it. But let's just say if the backend request itself fails, then you would see error screen in the remix itself. So to emulate that, I can stop the backend server and try to reload the product page. You would see error saying that it couldn't connect to the backend. You can customize this error in Remix, but if the backend fails, you would see a proper error in Remix itself.
This looks very similar to Next.js. So what advantage does, because I understand Remix is getting more popular. So what are the things that it is getting more popular than Next.js?
Right, that's also a good question. So this loader functionality in itself, I would say, is not something that's going to beat Next.js. Now, this feature is something is in is in par with Next.js, right? But there are other features that you'll be seeing in the upcoming time that would give you the impression that it's doing a little bit more than what Next.js does. Another thing that Remix does is when you have nested routes, right, that Next.js doesn't do in terms of loader function I'm talking about, right? So when you have nested components, right, if you are rendering it, Remix would be intelligent enough to figure out all the loader function in subcomponent, and it would call them in a in a parallel way. It wouldn't wait for every component to render before calling it. So your network waterfall would be very flat. It wouldn't be like the first API loaded, then the component rendered, and it figures out that need to also has a loader function called that. So it wouldn't be in that waterfall model, but it would be in a stack. It knows all the loader function. It picks up all the loader functions, calls them in a single group.
Yeah, so that's something which is different from Nest.js, right? In Nest.js, we have to load all the data on the main page, right?
Correct. Right.
But so here we have the flexibility of having loaders in subcomponents also, right?
Exactly. When it comes to subcomponents, so this is very useful when we go into the client-side routing that you were saying, Kiran. So let's just say you move to another component through client-side routing, and Remix would figure out all the loader function and all the subcomponent, call them in a single group.
Oh, on the client side also.
In client side also. So that would be very efficient because you wouldn't see a waterfall in that.
Yeah, got it. Interesting. There is one question in the chat if you want to take a look at.
Yep. High-load application, for example, okay, so it's actually again a good question. So this is where again Remix kind of little bit shines, right? So he's asked, someone asked, like let's just say it has a high amount of load, and like how are we gonna handle it? One way by which you can do is caching, right? In Next.js, to cache your response is not that straightforward, right? But Remix makes it super straightforward. How? Let me show you. Right. So here we are doing a little bit of overwork, right? We are getting a response from fetch. We are converting it to JSON and stuff. But there is no need for you to do all those stuff. We can just say this. Because the loader function return type can be multiple things. You can return a JSON. You can also return a HTTP response, right? What fetch response with is nothing but a HTTP response, right? This would still work because Remix knows that you gave back a response, and this response needs to be converted into a JSON, and it does it for you. So let's follow that, right? You can also do some little awesome stuff. Like what you can do is, let's just say you got a response here, right? Just say, So I'm going to take the response body. What is the cache header that we spent? I think cache control. I think, yeah, cache control. Let's just say I put some number here, right? Cache control header, yeah. So rather than returning the actual response, I'm going to send the cache response. Right. Now, if I reload, sorry, if I go and reload. Okay, did I miss anything here? Is it a promise or something? No. So let me say if I can, or I can do something like this also. Response headers cache control. And then I can send the response. Cool. So I think right now our server shouldn't be getting any request, I think, but I'm not sure. It does get, but during the client side routing, you shouldn't get a request because it would be cached in your browser. So to do that, let me probably add a client side routing. Right. So I'm going to add a back button here. Sorry, it shouldn't be a button, it should be a link component. We'll come back to link soon, but for the sake of demo, I'm going to jump a little ahead. Link. We have a back component, it's going to be in this, I'm going to convert the product title into again a link component. It's going to be new product ID. Okay.
Import the link also.
So if you can see, if I now go back, it makes a request and it would be cached. You can see it should have a cache control header right now. It doesn't. Okay. Let me see. Should have a cache control header. But what I'm trying to say here is, if you set a cache control header when you're sending back the response from the loader, right? What would happen is it would cache it for that period of time, and it would make make the request back to your server. Since Remix always works in terms of request and response. That's one big advantage of Remix. Wherever you go, you can use the same fetch, request, and response. So I hope that answers that question. So we jumped a little bit ahead in terms of the link tag. So let me talk a little bit about the link tag, right? So usually we would use an anchor tag, right? So let's just say I replace this with an anchor tag. And change it with href, right? So what would happen is you would have full page reload, right? which is always not a great experience when it comes to single page application. So using that link tag would ensure that when you are navigating from one page to another, you have a client-side kind of routing, right? So what if we disable JavaScript, right? So the remix link tag is kind of intelligent enough. When you disable JavaScript, it falls back to normal anchor tag. It would redirect like you didn't have JavaScript in your page, right? So yeah, meanwhile, I'm going to give a quick 5 minutes for everyone to catch up on like what we have written right now. So I'm going to replace this with this one. So this should do the trick for you to do data from the back.
So, suppose we want to implement state management over here, like Redux or something. So, how is we're gonna implement over here, like after once we get the response from the loader data and then add it to the store, or like how?
Right, that's a good question. So when it comes to Remix, right, they recommend no state management library. Mostly, you should go about with the HTTP caching. There are two types of state management, right? One is server-side state management, one is client-side state management. In server-side state management, you are just managing all the response that you got from the server, and you're invalidating the cache so that you don't make another request to the server unless it's needed, right? Client-side state management, in which you have information about things like themes and other stuffs which are not relevant to your server, right? So client-side management are very low. Like you just have few data that you want to manage in the client. For that, you can easily use some like Zustand or some small client state management tool that should be good enough. For server state management tool, Remix already does a lot of things that you might get out of Redux or any other state management tool for server side. Right? You might be aware of a tool called React Query, right? Which kind of catches your response, like invalidates it, but Remix already does it for you in many ways. If you follow the Remix philosophy, you would get most of the features that they provide in Remix itself. We will get through a demo for that when we are doing it. But most of the time you're not going to need it, but let's just say you had a burning request that you need to have Redux for some kind of use case, right? In that case, what you can do is Redux is something that can be run on server and also in the browser, right? You can just use it, but whenever you're setting or fetching data from it, you should like do that data initialization stuff in the loader, right? So you need to build an idempotent Redux store that can run in the browser and also in the server.
Okay. So Amir, I have a question. So like right now we are loading all the products at once. Like right now we have only 3 products. Say if you have 1,000 products and we want to load like 10 products through the server and the rest of the products on the client side. Is there any way in the remix, or do we need to handle through our logic we can write in the reactors?
So why would you want to fetch some of the products in the client?
Like the performance of the thing, like instead of loading all the data at once through the server to the client side, sending all the data at once, right? Instead of like the 10 or 20 we can get from the server for the better user experience, rest we load on the demand, like the user scroll the page or something or something.
Yeah. So usually what we can do is, in that case, you can do pagination. When you are making a request to the server, you can initially load a product of 10, right? When pagination happens, you can handle them in the client side, right? So what I mean by that is, when it comes to pagination, right, you will get a query param for like what was passed to, right? Like if I console log what are the arguments that are getting passed to the loader, right? So let's just say you are passing page equal to 1, right? Your loader would also get that data if you console log and so.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Right. From that you can, from that request, like you get a request object actually, So from the request object, you can see what was the query param and all those things you can do. Right? So it's just again a request object like the MD and request object. All the thing that you get out of it, you will get in this. So using that, you can manage what you make a request to the by.
So that's loader function only works on the server side, or it works on the client side also? Like I pass the argument like page one. Now the page one is come from the server to the front end. Now the page two has been clicked on the client side. So that the loader function will work, or do I need to write own like function for using hydrate or something?
Loader would already work because let's just say you have this loaded from the server, right? I clicked on a product details page, right? No product request was made here, right? Yet. If I go back, now you can see that a new request was made to the server with the same data. Now the loader function was called in the client side.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Right? So when you are doing a client side routing, like when you are navigating from one to another using client side routing, the loader function is going to be called in the client. But when you are doing, when it's getting rendered in the server, the loader function is going to be called in the server.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Amir, what if the fetch functionality depends on the props from the parent? How do we handle that?
Okay, that's actually a good question. So what do you mean by that is if I want to pass some props?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so let me think about it. Not sure how probably it would work with, like, let's just say if you think in terms of okay, so in that case, right, the parent component would be rendering the child component, right? Okay, so in that case,
It would definitely be a waterfall, I guess.
Yep, it would definitely
because it depends on the parent. But maybe then we have to use something like use effect or something for this special case.
Exactly. So I think in that case, right, server-side rendering wouldn't work because like you wouldn't know what data that needs to be fetched ahead of time, right?
Yeah.
In that case, again, as you said, you might have to go with use effect itself rather than going with the loader object.
Yeah,
And most of the like the loaders mostly work in terms of the page level, not on the component level. So you may not have a loader for a loader function available for a component itself. You should do it only on a page level.
Okay, so the only difference between this and Nest.js is it can have multiple loaders, but even the loader is tied with the subroutes, right? Not the components.
Exactly, not the components, exactly.
Got it.
So when it comes to nested route also, in that case also, you would be tying it to a page itself, not to like the top part of the route itself, not to the individual component. Those loader functions will work.
Yeah, I think Akash is asking, can we pass arguments to loader? I guess it gets some default arguments like request and such, right?
Right, exactly. And it also gets an extra argument for context. So that context data, you can send it from your server. Like we had this entry point, right, for the server where we are rendering the thing and we are passing a remix context. Using the handle request. Here, the default is remix context. I think you can also specify some extra context arguments here. Like you can spread remix context, add some extra context, and you will get that object in the loader.
Got it.
Good. So I think everyone should have caught up to this. So like till now, I think it was mostly about like how it works with things, and like it was very much similar to Next.js. So this feature that you're gonna build is very unique to how Remix itself handles stuff, right? So let's just say I add a button here for delete functionality. What we would mostly do is clicking on the delete button, we would make a network request. request. We would have a on-click handler, and this would make a request to our backend, and it would say that like delete this and like let me know, right? Even in Next.js, we would do the same. We would make an on-click handler and do it. But when it comes to Remix philosophy, any mutation that happens from the front end should not go through like your own handle fetch request. It should go through as web always suggests, you should go through something called a form action, right? So if you remember the earlier days of web, whenever we want to do any kind of mutation, whenever we want to submit something, we would use a form component. And that form component would send the data to the server, and the server would handle it, and you will get back the data from the server, right? So after the React and stuff came in, what we did, we didn't care about form. We would like make direct fetch request, and we have to refetch the data manually. That's where things like React query and other libraries come into picture, where you're not sure whether the data that like you mutated has been invalidated in your cache, right? Let's see what are the advantages that we get out of this. But to start with, let's just say you want to delete a product, right? So the form component takes a method argument. So this method is always going to be post, right? And then the action is going to be the URL where it's going to hit, right? So it should be unique to every product. So what we're going to do is we're going to call it as products/ID. So the product.id, this is where it's going to hit, right? And here we're going to have the delete button that we deleted. So, and it's going to be a summary. Right? If I have that now, if I reload, we have a delete button now. If I click on delete, we do get an error saying that this cannot happen because the post request to this was made, but you did not provide an action for the route. So what Remix is trying to say is, we hit the route product/ID, this particular route, right? In that case, for this particular component to handle a form request, a form submission, you should declare a function called action, right? And this action is going to take a set of arguments, right? One of the argument is nothing but params, right? For now, I'm going to just console log the params, right? I just console log the params. Let me go back, reload the page, click on delete. It reached out to the page, but let's just see if we got anything in the server or something, or did we get any console log? Go back, reload, delete. It says that we defined an action for the route, but it didn't return anything from our action, right? So from the action, you should return something. So I'm going to return null for now. We'll come back to this. So I'm going to come back, reload, delete. Now let's see, got anything? We got printed saying that ID was wrong, right? So for our action, we got the route parameter, which was ID is 1, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to spread out, get the ID from it. Right now, I'm going to make a network request. Yep, we are coming to that. I'll show you just a minute. Okay. So now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the same fetch request that we have here. Right. So I'm going to await it. I'm going to say products / I'm going to make a fetch request to it, and it's going to be 90. And here I'm going to say the method is going to be delete, because my server is backend server, Express server is designed in a way that if a request, delete request comes to this, it will get deleted. Here. Yeah. It has a delete method. If it gets a delete request, it will delete the product, right? And it's going to return null, right? So usually what we want to do is, once this deletion is done, we need to go get redirected to the actual page, right? So you have a redirect method, So I'm going to use the redirect method. So you can go back to the root page. Reload and come delete. Not the root page, my bad. It should be products. Okay, so I'm going to go to products. So I'm going to click delete. It got deleted. Right. I'm going to restart the server. Sorry, not this one. I'm going to restart the backend server so that it gets rehanded. Yeah, if I click on delete, as you can see, there was a page reload and our product was deleted, right? And our entire list of product also got refreshed, right? We didn't have to manage our state ourselves. When it got redirected, it did a refetch and it got updated, right? Any questions, Good. So till now, what we are doing is just normal web stuff. We are not doing anything specific to JavaScript or anything. All we are doing is there's no JavaScript involved. If you see clearly, there's no JavaScript involved in this request. We are adding a form component. We are adding a button component, which is making a submit. This would work even without a JavaScript, right? And this is making a request to our server. So this is hitting our server here. This action is getting executed in the server. This is not getting executed in our client. So this is getting executing the server, and it's making a request to delete it, and it is getting redirected. The server is redirecting us back to the products page, right? Now you might be thinking like this is not a great experience, right? When you click on delete, you are getting a hard reload. Page is getting hard reloaded, and you're getting another redirect to the products, right? Even though this required no JavaScript, it takes away the single page application field, right? App like feeling that there is no page reload at all, right? So this is where Remix kind of shines. Here we were using the normal form component, right? If you replace this with Remix form component, right, you would see magic. So you have a Remix form component now. Click on delete, no page reload. Click on delete, no page reload. Did anyone see that? There was no page reload at all. You clicked on delete, it did the delete, it refetched the data, and you're you didn't do anything specifically to refetch. Remix did it for you. Cool. That's one advantage actually of using the form component in the form way of doing stuff rather than you making a fetch request. Right? Even that is not at the best case, right? So now, if you go and disable JavaScript, right? Click on delete, user would get a full page reload, but that's okay. But they are still getting the same functionality without JavaScript. Isn't that great? If you did this in Next.js or React with like event listening and stuff, this wouldn't work with the JavaScript. Right? This is what Remix calls as progressive enhancement. You enable JavaScript, follow Remix philosophy, your app would work great in JavaScript, but still if user disables the JavaScript, you would still get the app working in the normal way, like how web used to work. Any questions? So this is where again Remix stands out pretty awesome, like compared to any framework. You're just doing web stuff. You're not doing abstraction stuff. You're doing web stuff. You want enhancement, you replace that web stuff with Remix. If you disable JavaScript, you are gonna get just degraded into the older web performance and not able to use the page at all, like older JavaScript stuff.
But like suppose if we are using sorry. Suppose if we are using any third-party form like Formic or something, so how will we get this functionality over there?
Yeah, so again, like this is what Remix says. Don't use any library for form. Like we are abstracting every form thing into a JavaScript functionality, right? Remix says that you avoid that, you use normal form the way it's meant to be without any JavaScript, you will get this stuff, right? You would be thinking about how I do client-side validation and stuff. We will be coming to that soon. But if you want to use Formic, you can still use it. Remix is not stopping you from using it. But if you're doing a lot of stuff using Formic, which requires JavaScript to run, then you would lose the Remix philosophy of running without JavaScript. So it's in your hand. if you follow Remix philosophy, you will have a web app that runs with and without JavaScript. But at some point in time, you feel like Remix is not doing my stuff. I want Formic or any form like final form and stuff to do my stuff. Then you need to do the trade-off.
Okay, got it.
So the thing that I have touched in form here is very minimal, just to keep it simple for everyone. But Remix has more form stuff, which is in par with Formic provides. So you should be able to figure out all your requirements with like Remix form rather than using form.
Understood. Okay.
So this is not adding any kind of JavaScript bundle to you. Like if you use Formic today, you would have a lot of JavaScript bundle added to you. Since this is coming with the framework, you can without JavaScript, it's gonna still work. So, good. So I'm gonna give a few minutes for you all to catch up. I'm also gonna take a small break for 5 minutes. So feel free to try this out. Let me know if you face any issues or have any questions. Okay.
So yeah, so we'll take a short break, 5-minute break. And meanwhile, if you want, you can go through the Redux Remix docs, or you can try out whatever Amir explained so far. And we'll get started after 5 minutes. If you have more questions, you can leave those questions in the chat as well.
Okay, so I'm back. Let me know if you have any questions. Cool. So I think let's move on to implementing the product details page. It's kind of pretty simple though. We're gonna add another. I would suggest like try to like rather than following me, try to implement it yourself. We want to just get the list of products, right? You just need to make a GET request to this route. You get the product details for that product, right? So I'm gonna export a function for loader, right? And in the loaders, you would again get params. So using the params, I'm gonna split it into ID. And then I'm gonna return fetch request for that. And then I'm gonna get the product. So I should probably have seen some that was unfortunate. Let me reload it. Okay. Okay, I didn't console log it. Okay, I need to console log product. So I do get a product back from the package. So I'm going to just log it. Cool. So we have the product detail page also working. So I think I probably figured out what I like missed out. Like I created a response, right? In the response, you can set in the headers. You need to follow the method called. You need to use a method called set. I think I do that, and if I provide probably a huge value. Return the response. I think the client side response should be cached. That's what I think. Let's do tag. We'll go back and make another request. Oh, it was still not cached. Not sure why. Maybe in local it doesn't cache or not very sure. Cool. So I think everyone is up to speed. I will probably check this out and get back to you on Twitter. Why this is not working? Should probably work. Your response should be cached in the browser. With this simple trick. Cool. So I think if everyone is done with it, let's move on to the next page.
Hey, Amir, I have a question that when is the action bit executed? Like currently, when we go to the product/2, the loader part is fetching the data and showing it, right?
Yep.
So the action function, when does it work? Like where it was deleting it earlier. Like I'm a bit confused since we are loading the same out.
Right. So the loader and action get differentiated on the method of the request that you're making. If you make a get request, then the load function will be executed. If you make a post request, action is executed.
Oh, okay, got it.
Right. It's the same route. That's how like the web has been differentiating the request for this like for all the time, right? If you make a get request, you know it's a get request for the same route. For post request, you know post request for the same. Right. This is again how Remix differentiates itself from Next also. So it's using the web standards to like do things, right? Cool. Yeah. So let's create a form where you can create a new product, right? You can add a new product. So I'm going to create a new .jsx. I'm going to add a link to the index.js page, which can problem. Cool. So in the new product, I'm going to probably add the link before we do that. I'm going to use the link tag that we get from Remix. Compliant. Am I doing anything wrong here? Product.
Link is defined 2 times in the line number 1.
Yeah, you're right. Cool. We are getting redirected, so we have a new form. So I'm going to use the remix form again, right, to make a normal post request. So here the action is going to be the same. It's going to make a request to the products page, right, /new, right. We're going to make the request to the same page as a post request. So the method is going to be post, and I'm going to have an input field. It's going to be physical text. This folder is going to be. I think we should probably always add label. Just for the sake of workshop, I might just the input with a placeholder, but you should provide a name for the input, like we always do for form. We used to do, right? We provide title, right? So here we're gonna build this form again in a way that it can run without JavaScript, can run better with JavaScript, right? I'm gonna create another type input and description, and its placeholder is gonna be description. I'm gonna add a button. Button type is going to be submit, and it's going to be save. So we have a form working for us, but it wouldn't work right away, I think so. Just for the sake of a little bit of clarity, I'm going to add a break tag here and there. So I'm going to type something, save. It should work actually. Did we make the right things? Yeah, it wouldn't work because we don't have the action, right? So for that, I'm going to export an async function, which we can call as action. Right. So in this action, I'm going to get a request object. So this request object, what is special about is it's the same request object that you get in a normal fetch request. Right? So you can go and search in MDN that like what does this request object has. It has a body, it has mode, all those things that are available there. And you can convert it, the response, the thing into JSON and stuff. You can get the form data that you want. Right. So let's try to parse our request into a JSON. Or we can use form data probably, because like I think when it gets submitted, it wouldn't get converted into JSON, but it would be submitted in form of form data, right? Not as JSON. So what we need to do is we need to get the form data, right? Wait for it. Request form data. I think form data. Yeah. So I'm gonna return null again here, but let's come back to this. I want to just console log the form data that we're getting. Yeah, new, typing something, save. we got a request object here. So what I'm going to do is, for now, I'm going to go to the server and say that we got title, description that we type. So we are getting the form data, right? So to get the title and stuff out of it, you can use title is equal to form data. There's a method called get, using which you can get the title, and then you can get the description using form data get. Right. Again, no need to console log, but let's just say if I want to make a fetch request, right? We have title and description. I want to make a request to my server. So I'm going to do the same fetch request and stuff. So I'm going to make a fetch request. And it's going to be products. And I'm going to make a post request. So the method is going to be post. We want to send a body. And the body is going to be what the JSON stringify. Right. So I'm going to put the title and description here. And then we want to also set headers. We should not forget to set the content type header because the content type header, if you don't set the content type header to applications/JSON, our backend may not be able to deserialize it from JSON. By default, I think it gets converted into the request gets converted into URL encoded format, so which may not be able to be deserialized in the backend, because my backend is right now trying to deserialize in form of JSON. Right, so I'm going to set the headers to content type applications/JSON. Cool. So then I'm going to redirect it back to the product page that we have. So let's save it. Let me type in something, save it. And we did get the response, right? So you can see that we refetched it and we have the new product. So I can delete, we can add a new product. I can say pencil, hello, save. So we did get it, right? Any questions till now?
So it refetches all the products automatically, or in the network call it does the network different call for that request?
It does make a different call for itself for that particular request.
Okay.
So when it goes back from, it gets redirected to products page, it gets it refetches to ensure that you have latest data. Right. And the best part here is, even without, again, if you disable JavaScript, you would get a page reload to submit the form. Your server would handle it and you'd still get the new product. In case if you use Formicon stuff, you wouldn't happen, but in case if you use Remix form, it would happen. Right. So now there was a question again in the workshop that, like, what if I want to do validations, right? What if I want to do yeah, exactly. What if I want to handle, what do you mean by exceptions? I think you wouldn't mean exceptions in the API. Do you want to handle exceptions in the form field by validation you mean? Okay, so in that case, let me assume that you are talking about in terms of validation, right? So let's just say you had some kind of validation, right? You want to do a validation. But if you take Next.js or any other application right now, right, you actually do two validation. You do a client-side validation, then you go to the server and do a server-side validation. Correct? Am I right? What if you can do all that thing using one single logic, right? Like you do write code for once, and your code gets validated like it's being done in client-side, but your server is also validating it, right? You can do that with Remix. Let me show you. So for now, I'm going to just validate if title is not empty or not, right? I'm going to say if title is empty, right? I'm going to do an arithmetical. Okay. In this case, I'm going to say errors, and in this, I'm going to say title cannot be empty. right? So I did an early return, so the fetch request is never going to be called, right? So now, like loaded data, we can access the action data. So I can say action data is equal to use action data from remix, right? So what I can do is I can go over here and see if action data and then action data dot errors dot map error right? So if I go back to products, new product, save. Did I make any mistakes here? Get action data, I returned errors.
There is a semicolon there, I guess, and
Where? Okay, here I think, yeah, that's right. Okay, I'm not returning it. My bad. Put it in this. Okay. So if I do that, if I save, now you can see that I got an error, right? Title cannot be empty. This happened in the server side, and I got to see it in the client, right? Your logic now is written once, so your client knows like where was the error when submitting the form. So you didn't make the fetch request, you got a list of error and you did, right? You can make it in a more cosmetic way as you like, but error handling was done in the server. You didn't do extra work in the client. Isn't that great? Any questions on this?
So I have a question. So like most of the time we are not firing the validation on submit. Some validation will fire on the on blur also. So,
right.
So how we can that just idea can you give us?
Cool, sure. So when you go with on blur, right? It happens. It should be in a client side. You cannot do it in the server side, right? So in that case, you are forced to use a client side way of doing it, right? But it's not still a bad idea, because if this JavaScript gets disabled, right, user will not get instant access on whether the username was taken, stuff like that, correct? It's mostly like you always don't want the user to know everything. It's a good experience, but it is not an absolute necessary. While submitting it, they may get to know what are the errors. Right? Some of the users are even irritated before they submit the form. They get to see the errors. Right? So it's very subjective. You can definitely add some JavaScript to make it that way, but to get something minimal, right, to ensure that nothing goes wrong in your server, you can use Remix itself rather than doing client-side validation.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Cool. So one of my friends just pinged the mistake that I was doing on the caching issue. So if I go back to the cache that we were doing, right, we were getting response. Response is equal to, I need to say response headers dot set cache control. I was setting the key wrong. The key is something like this. Max age is equal to this. It shouldn't be just that. So I shouldn't have done this for that one. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to do it for the loader. Okay, so let's see now if it's getting cached or not. Products, network, click on it. Okay, headers. Back. Okay, so go back. Still, it's okay. It's now in with disk cache, I think. Yes, this is coming from the disk cache. So go back. You can see one of them is coming from disk cache. This is coming from the disk cache, so which was cached. So this is again upon power of Remix. You can set all the response headers from the loader function. You can get whatever response you want from your backend, right? This is just an aggregation way, right? You can make a request to a microservice, and if you think that microservice is getting hit a lot, what you can do is whenever you get a response from the microservice, you can say like this microservice response is going to be cached in the browser for this amount of time. Then another request is never going to be made from your browser. Right? Make sense? This is another unique feature of Remix itself. In Next.js, you don't control it that easily using that loader functions that you get in Remix. Cool. Any questions, Nino? Cool. I hope there are no more questions. Cool. So that's all I had for today. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. You can ping me in Twitter also. But this is all I had. But this is again just scratching the surface of Remix. I would suggest like go back to the docs and read more. There are much more to Remix. These are the very crucial features that I thought. Another thing that like I also wanted to point out is you can deploy this to any place you want, like Cloudflare workers. So Cloudflare workers are something that is pretty new. So let me tell you what new it is about it, right? It's very theoretical, but I think you would enjoy it. So let's just say you have a server, right? You make a request to a server. You want index.html. Today, the response is something like once like you get to like the response, you get it in one go, right? The index.html with the entire content you get as a response, right? To your browser. That's how it works. So you get for index.html, the browser gets the entire HTML content, right? Entire HTML content. Right? So this can be your Next.js server, right? So Next.js gives back the entire HTML content, right? Where it has to render the entire HTML. Once the entire HTML is ready, it would send it back to you. So it would SSR it and send it back to you, right? One big problem with this is, let's just say you had a huge page and it's taking time for you to render the entire page, then the user doesn't see anything for a good amount of time, right? So we can avoid this using something called streaming. What streaming is? Streaming is nothing but like this is Remix here. When Remix is trying to render stuff, few HTML content is going to be ready as soon as possible, right? The head tag, the title tag, some content it has rendered, it's going to be ready, right? So what Remix is going to do, it's going to stream those response back to your browser. So what would happen? Your browser would see some content, some loader icons, right? And as soon as entire thing was rendered in the Remix, you get back the remaining content. This is not possible today with Next.js, but Remix already does it, something called streaming. It comes out of the box with Remix. Right? And Remix has nothing much to do with Node.js itself. If you take Next.js, it's pretty much very tied with Node, right? So if you want to run Next.js in any place today, you need a Node server, right? But Remix uses a lot of browser APIs like response, request, and stuff, and it doesn't use much of Node.js API itself. It can run in the edge in something called Cloudflare workers, right? Cloudflare worker is nothing but kind of not exactly Node.js environment, but it can run your browser kind of code, right? It doesn't have any cold start, and it is distributed across the world. So whenever you are requesting it from India, you will get a response back from a server that is sitting near India. So that's why they call it as an edge network, right? To make it possible, they cannot run Node.js, which is heavy, right? They need to run something that is lightweight. So they run some kind of runtime which supports you to run some browser-specific APIs like request and response. Since Remix already uses just request and response, it can easily run on Cloudflare, and you can deploy it across the edge, and your user will get the response from the nearby edge server. Any questions?
To do the server-side rendering, it still needs some Node, right? No.
Actually, it actually just needs JavaScript for it, right? So it needs to just run some JavaScript, And this Cloudflare workers just support running JavaScript, and it does support some browser APIs, not all the Node APIs.
Okay, so so is this tied to a particular company, or can I run this on an AWS? Can I get this?
Okay. You mean the edge network itself?
Yes, yeah.
I think right now the technology is with Cloudflare. The Cloudflare workers is proprietary to with Cloudflare itself, like how they make sure that it doesn't have that cold start. Like there is that usually we have 5-10 second cold start for any serverless function. You make a call, if it's not been active, you take 5 seconds for it to bring it. But Cloudflare has some kind of workaround for it, so that you don't have the cold start, but it's specific to it's proprietary to Cloudflare, right? As of now.
Got it.
Cool. That's all I had. So I hope you all enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any feedbacks, anything that I could have done better. Feel free to. Yeah, edge runtime is just slim. I wouldn't say it's exactly Node runtime, but you can think about it as a replacement for Node, which is like Cloudflare has kept it in their folds.
Got it. Thanks, Amir. It was really helpful. Even I'm new to remits. I got to learn a lot of cool features. Yeah, I'll definitely try it out and learn more about it.
Sure.
Yeah,
Thanks.
maybe after some time we can do a little bit of advanced workshop as well. Yeah, so hope everyone enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach Amir on Twitter. And yeah, so with that, we will end this session soon. And I think we keep having these workshops and meetups regularly, and we even have a meetup coming on Feb 19th. So do check out our Twitter and meetup pages for the updates. And yeah, we'll see you in the next meetup.
Thanks for having me again. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Amir, for the workshop. Yeah.
Thanks, Amir.
Bye, everyone.
Samir.
Bye.